Hello. Today we are going to talk about this beautiful lady here. Everybody knows it is Virginia Woolf. Virginia Woolf was born in 1882 and died in 1941. It was a suicide. She was the third child of Leslie Stephen. Her father, Leslie Stephen, was a Victorian man of letters, and his beautiful second wife, Julia Duckworth. Virginia's sister was Vanessa. Vanessa Bell she became, because later she became the wife of Clive Bell. Clive Bell was a critic of art and literature. Virginia and Vanessa had two brothers, Toby and Adrian. Toby died of typhoid, and it was a very great grief for Virginia. The family lived at Hyde Park Gate. I have gone there, and there is a hotel there, and there is a blue plaque saying that Virginia Woolf used to live here. Later they moved to Bloomsbury, where the Bloomsbury group was formed. In the family, Virginia was nicknamed the Goat. That is quite famous. Virginia had a mental breakdown following Toby's death, and she had also lifelong nervous illness. Now let us take a look at the Woolfs a little more. Virginia married Leonard Woolf in 1912. Leonard Woolf had been in the Ceylon civil service before marriage. Together they founded the Hogarth Press. In the Hogarth Press, they first published 2 stories. That is the title of the book. And the book had 1 story by each of them, published in 1917. Catherine Mansfield's short story Prelude was also published here. T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land was also published here. Not the first publication, that was in the Criterion. Hogarth Press published The Waste Land in 1923. The Bloomsbury group was formed, and let us take a look at their formation, how they were formed. The beginnings were at Cambridge University, where they were all students and they began to interact with one another, the members. The group was an informal, fluctuating group of friends. Not the same people all the time. Some people were permanent, others were fluctuating, the members. These people were writers, artists, thinkers, engaged in writing modernist fiction. They were also engaged in post-impressionist art, aesthetic theory, cultural analysis, and leftist leanings they all had. Leftist liberal political views. All the members of the Bloomsbury group rejected Victorian social mores. They rejected traditional religion and codes of behavior. They experimented in sexuality. Many of them were bisexual. And in family life also. All the members of the Bloomsbury group were influenced by G.E. Moore's Principia Ethica. Please do Google search on G.E. Moore's Principia Ethica. It might be very important in the exam. The Bloomsbury group debated the nature of reality and representation, and also on the fate of idealism and the possibility of ethics in the 20th century. What is reality? How can it be represented? Will idealism really work out? Does it have a practical side? And how far is ethics possible in the 20th century? There were 14 core members. The other members kept shifting. The core members were Leonard and Virginia Woolf, Vanessa and Clive Bell, Lytton Strachey, that he wrote the book of biographies, Eminent Victorians. Roger Fry, he was an artist. David Garnett, Duncan Grant, John Maynard Keynes, he was an economist. Molly and Desmond McCarthy, E.M. Foster, you know him as a writer, Sidney Saxon Turner, and Virginia's and Vanessa's brother Adrian Stephen. Toby had died. It will be good to look up these names a little more and find some more details. They might ask some question in the exam. You can see a very famous photograph of some of the members of the Bloomsbury group. Virginia is in the center. This is Virginia sitting on the doorstep. This is outside a summer house with her house guests. You can see the economist Maynard Keynes on the right. Angelica Bell, Vanessa Bell, and Clive Bell. Only one legs are there of one person. Virginia's life was one of paradoxes. In character, she was very English, yet she was an outsider to English culture. Very English in character, yet an outsider. In her non-fiction work, 3 Guineas, that is a sequel to A Room of One's Own, in 3 Guineas, she even imagines founding a society of outsiders. Virginia had the legacy of Victorianism. She was out and out an upper class Victorian woman. Yet she was defiantly modern also. She defied Victorian mores, as I told you. So that is another paradox. She was drawn to the aristocratic and the privileged. Yet she identified with those on the margins. That's another paradox. Most of her protagonists are also misfits in the society, like Virginia herself. You can see that in Mrs. Dalloway, To the Lighthouse. Virginia's novels depict inner life of characters. I have already done a video on modern fiction, her essay. There also she highlights the fact that Virginia and the Bloomsbury group people write about inner life of characters, while Arnold Bennett, John Galsworthy, etc. write about external life. So Virginia in her novels depicted the inner life of characters shaped by external social reality, but she did not depict external social reality. Virginia emphasizes private life in her fiction. Virginia Woolf writes about loneliness, love, friendship, art. All these get mixed up in all her narratives. She ignores external social reality, and in all her novels there's a remarkable lack of incidents. Nothing really happens. It is almost like imagist poetry. In the essay Mr. Bennet and Mrs. Brown, Virginia Woolf said, "I believe that all novels, that is to say, deal with character, and that it is to express character, not to preach doctrines, sing songs, or celebrate the glories of the British Empire. All novels should deal with character. A novel should be about expressing character. It should not be trying to preach doctrines or sing songs or celebrate the glories of the British Empire," she says. In modern fiction, she attacked the materialism of Galsworthy and Bennett for assuming that the external details of people's lives can reveal their inner worlds. In modern fiction, you can watch the video. She attacked the materialism of Galsworthy and Bennett. And she says that Galsworthy and Bennett assume that the external details of people's lives can reveal their inner worlds. She has also written conventional social novels like Night and Day and The Years. Her modernist novels are experimental and impressionistic. Remember, she has also written conventional social novels. All her novels are not modernist. Her modernist novels are experimental and impressionistic. They emphasize character analysis and personal consciousness, and they employ stream of consciousness technique. You know already that stream of consciousness is a very important technique in modernism. Dorothy Richardson, James Joyce, and others have used it. Now a look at Virginia Woolf's early novels. Her first novel is The Voyage Out, published in 1915. The original title is Melimbrosia. Rachel Windrace is the protagonist. She embarks on a modern mythical voyage of self-discovery. She's going on a mythical voyage of self-discovery. The Voyage Out introduces the character Clarissa Dalloway, who will play the major role in Mrs. Dalloway. Night and Day came in 1919, and it contrasts the daily lives and romantic attachments of two acquaintances, Catherine Hilbery and Mary Datchet. So they can ask you a question on the theme of Night and Day. Which of the following novels of Virginia Woolf has this theme? Or in which novel are there characters Catherine Hilbery and Mary Datchet? They can ask you to chronologically arrange modernist novels. At least the very important ones you should know the publication date of. Publication history is important. So, such questions you can expect. People have been asking me, okay, your videos are good and entertaining, but we can't answer questions from it. That is because you don't know what kind of questions are going to be asked probably. So, these are the questions that can be asked. They can give you characters' names and ask you which book it is. They can ask you the theme of a novel. Which of the following is the theme of Virginia Woolf's Voyage Out or Night and Day? Or they can give you the theme and ask you which is the novel, or vice versa. They can give you the novel and ask you the theme, or give you the theme and ask you the novel. They can ask you to chronologically arrange the major novels. And they can ask you important incidents. Which of the following did not happen in To the Lighthouse? Of course, To the Lighthouse will be discussed in detail. Then you can answer that question. Virginia Woolf has also written short stories and sketches. Some of her important short stories are Kew Gardens, Monday or Tuesday. Another expected question is, given below are the short stories of the major modernist writers. Short stories by one short story by James Joyce, one short story by Virginia Woolf, one short story by D.H. Lawrence, like that can be given. And they will ask you, match the short stories with their authors. So, be prepared for such questions. Now, experimental novels, that is the modernist novels of 1920s. One important modernist novel is Jacob's Room, published in 1922, the same year as Ulysses and The Wasteland were published. We will talk about in detail. It is the life story of the protagonist Jacob Flanders, and it is presented entirely through the impressions of other characters. It is stream of consciousness, and this is a very important modernist technique. The protagonist is not the speaking subject, and you get to know about the protagonist through other people's impressions of the protagonist. This is the technique used in the American writer William Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury as well. We will talk about it in detail after a while. Let me first give you an overview. So the first experimental novel was Jacob's Room, then Mrs. Dalloway came in 1925. We'll deal with it in detail. To the Lighthouse came in 1927. Orlando, a Biography came in 1928. It's an interesting book. We'll come to that also. It's a semi-biographical novel. It's biographical. It deals with the actual biography of Vita Sackville West, who was Virginia Woolf's friend and lesbian partner. But it is not a realistic biography. It is a semi-biographical novel based in part on the life of Woolf's lover, Vita Sackville West. The protagonist Orlando switches between genders. We'll come to that presently. Then first let us take a look at Jacob's Room, published in 1922. It was the first of Woolf's experimental novels and the first to be published in Hogarth Press. It is an episodic novel. When we talked about picaresque novels also, I used the term episodic. Episodic means full of episodes, different episodes put together. An episodic novel that presents the life story of the protagonist Jacob Flanders entirely through the impressions of other characters, especially the women in his life. An episodic novel that presents the life story of Jacob Flanders, that's a protagonist. The other characters are able to see only the surface of his character, and they are unable to understand his complexity. He's a very complex character, but the other characters who talk about Jacob are unable to understand his complexity. The novel is full of letters and conversations that reveal the impossibility of communication and human connection. The novel is not told through an omniscient third-person narrator. No modernist novel was narrated like that. It is full of letters and conversations that fragment the narrative, like in The Wasteland. And through these fragments reveal the impossibility of communication and human connection. Jacob is apparently simple and romanticizes everything. In the beginning, you see Jacob as a very simple man, straightforward man who thinks romantically about Greece, about the past, about his lover Florinda, who is in reality a prostitute. But eventually he recognizes the hollowness of his romanticizing. It is useless to romanticize, he realizes, and attains the complexity of adulthood. He becomes less simple in outlook. He becomes complex in his mind. That growing up or maturation, so to say, or loss of innocence of Jacob is a very important motif in the novel. The transition from simplicity to complexity in Jacob's character and life parallels the changeover from a pre-modern world to modernity. See, Jacob has a transition in his life from simplicity to complexity. From simple perceptions of life to understanding the complexities of life. That actually parallels the change of the world itself, from a pre-modern world to modernity. Modernity is complex. It is not so simple and straightforward. So which of the following is not true about Jacob's room? They can give you 4 sentences. You have to be good at the English language. You have to understand what is given in the question paper. You should know the basic things in a novel, for which you should study all these points I am telling you. But that is not enough. This is only like a skeleton. You should read on your own. You should, as you read, the more you read, these points in my PowerPoint presentation will get flesh and blood. They will come alive. So, Jacob's room shows Jacob Flanders, who is changing from a very simple man to a man who is aware of the complexities of life. That is actually paralleling the change of the world from the pre-modern to the modern. Jacob immerses himself in the mysteries of the past, travels to Greece to connect with the past, and eventually realizes that he cannot escape the 20th century with its changes and traumas. Jacob realizes that he cannot escape the 20th century with its changes and traumas. He cannot escape it. And at the end, Jacob disappears during the First World War. At the end of the novel, Jacob has disappeared, probably has been killed in the war. Or probably he has committed suicide. Or probably he has retreated into self-imposed exile. We do not know what happened to him. We don't have to know. Modernist novels have such loose endings. Loose ends will be there. Everything will not be answered or tied up. Jacob's mother and friends dispose of his old bills. That is what happens at the end of the novel. His old bills, his letters and other possessions in his abandoned room are all disposed of. And his possessions are thrown away. very symbolically, metaphorically. It is the end of one era, or it is the end of one man's saga. The last words are a pair of Jacob's old shoes. I am reminded of the abandoned red wheelbarrow lying in the backyard. So much depends on a red wheelbarrow, glazed with rainwater beside the white chickens, wrote William Carlos Williams. Like that, so much depends on a pair of old shoes, Jacob's old shoes. It is like a metaphor for Jacob's life, for Jacob's destiny, for his plight, which is the destiny of the old world, the old values. Everything has changed. Everybody has to go. Jacob's character is modeled on Virginia's brother Thorby, remember the one who died? And the novel uses impressionistic techniques like Henry James. Virginia Woolf also uses impressionistic techniques in writing, and also stream of consciousness technique. Next, we'll talk about Mrs. Dalloway, 1925 novel. Mrs. Dalloway depicts one day in the life of Clarissa Dalloway. Now, have you heard that before? Has somebody else written about one day? Yeah, Ulysses by James Joyce is about one day in the life of Leopold Bloom, Stephen Dedalus and Molly Bloom. 16th June 1904, that was that day. Mrs. Dalloway is like a female Ulysses because this novel also depicts one day in the life of the protagonist. Here it is Clarissa Dalloway. We already met her in The Voyage Out. This novel is therefore called a female Ulysses. Clarissa Dalloway is planning to give a party, and at the beginning, very famously, she's going to get out of the house to buy flowers. She is walking in London buying things that she needs, and at the end of the day the party happens. That day is the day depicted in the novel. The get together or party is a very important motif in many modernist novels. Somebody can do research on this. Party as a leitmotif in European modernist fiction, in British modernist fiction, you can see this. Get together of people actually highlights their loneliness. They are in the middle of people, but they are all lonely. Nobody understands one another. Everybody is lonely. The novel is about the impossibility of communication. Even though you have a lot of communications technologies in this time, is human connection really possible? This is the question raised by E.M. Forster as well. In Howard Zen, he wrote the epigraph, "Only connect." It shows the impossibility of connection actually and communication. So Clarissa Dalloway is moving about a teeming London shopping, and she is symbolically related to another character, Septimus Warren Smith. He is like a co-protagonist. Septimus Warren Smith is a war veteran driven to suicide in the novel. The novel is a penetrating study into the life of characters and their London background. London is like a character in the novel. A penetrating study into the life of characters. Clarissa Dalloway is a high society woman in post-World War I England. A high society woman, like Virginia Woolf. She walks around the city of London to prepare for the party she will host that evening. When she returns, an old suitor and friend, Peter Walsh, drops by her house unexpectedly. Years earlier, Clarissa had refused Peter's marriage proposal, and Peter has never got over it. Peter still wants her and remembers her. Peter asks Clarissa if she's happy with her husband Richard. She's not. But before she can answer, her daughter Elizabeth enters the room. Peter leaves and he goes to Regent's Park. That's a very important park in the novel. Parks are also very commonly found in a lot of modernist novels. Public spaces. in modernist novels is worth looking into. Septimus Warren Smith, the co-protagonist, I told you, is a World War I veteran suffering from shell shock. He spends his day in the park, same park, Regent's Park, with his Italian-born wife Lucrezia, where Peter Walsh observes them. The idea of park, urban spaces, urban public space or park, where the characters are wanderers or flaneurs. The whole city is like a park. It is related to Derrida. Peter Eisenman, I think, was the architect who worked with Derrida and created an urban park. Walter Benjamin. Look up these theories in relation to flaneur and park, public spaces, and modernism. So coming back to the novel, Septimus Warren Smith is in the park with his Italian-born wife Lucrezia, and Peter Walsh is observing them. Septimus is getting hallucinations, mostly concerning his dear friend Evans, who died in the war. Remember, he is suffering from shell shock. He is mentally depressed. Sir William Bradshaw is Septimus's psychiatrist. Sir William Bradshaw plans to send him to a mental institution. Later that day, when Dr. Holmes, another doctor, arrives at Septimus's apartment, there are two doctors here, the psychiatrist as well as Dr. Holmes. When Dr. Holmes arrives at Septimus's apartment, Septimus, fearing that the doctor will destroy his soul, jumps from a window and commits suicide. Septimus commits suicide by jumping from a window because he does not want to go to an asylum. He does not want the doctor to take away his soul. He has lost everything in the war. And now the doctors are taking away the rest of him. He is a victim of society's crimes. We are responsible for his death. That is what Clarissa feels. When somebody in our society dies of poverty or deprivation, commits suicide because of some kind of discrimination or deprivation, the entire society is responsible for it. Because we led to that system which led to this suicide. And Septimus is the victim of war, victim of all the oppressive institutions of the modernist society. Clarissa and Septimus are doubles. When Clarissa hears about Septimus's suicide, she feels responsible for his death. She identifies with him. Both these characters are disturbed by the sufferings and oppression of contemporary Britain. Now the party. Peter goes to Clarissa's party, where most of the novel's major characters are present. Clarissa works hard to make her party a success, but feels dissatisfied by her own role and is conscious of Peter's critical eye. More or less the same thing happens into The Lighthouse. Mrs. Ramsay is the woman who is throwing a party there. She has guests in her house and she's working hard to make the party successful, but everybody is lonely at the party. Nobody can understand others. It's a failure, the party. Clarissa then hears about Septimus's death and understands that he was overwhelmed by life and that men like Sir William make life intolerable. She identifies with Septimus, admiring him for not compromising his soul. You should not compromise your soul when the institutions try to take your soul. Sometimes some government servants will resign from their job. Some people might even commit suicide, like Septimus, because they are so human, they are so powerful. She identifies with Septimus, admiring him for not compromising his soul. She feels with her comfortable position as a society hostess responsible for his death. Now, there is a novel and a movie based on Mrs. Dalloway. The Hours is a novel by Michael Cunningham, 1998. It won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction in 1999. Later, it was made into an Oscar-winning movie starring Nicole Kidman, Meryl Streep, and Julianne Moore. In this novel, you see 3 generations of women affected by a Woolf novel. 3 generations of women. One is Virginia Woolf herself. The other is Clarissa Dalloway. So the author is there, the character is there. And then there is a woman who is reading Mrs. Dalloway. So the reader is also there. One of the characters is Woolf herself writing Mrs. Dalloway in 1923 and struggling with her own mental illness. Another character is Mrs. Brown, wife of a World War II veteran, who is reading Mrs. Dalloway in 1949 as she plans her husband's birthday party. The third is Clarissa Vaughan, a lesbian who plans a party in 2001 to celebrate a literary award received by her poet friend and former lover, Richard, who is dying of AIDS. So instead of Clarissa Dalloway, we have Clarissa Vaughan, played by Meryl Streep. Nicole Kidman played Virginia Woolf. We have them here. This is Meryl Streep as Clarissa, Julianne Moore as Mrs. Brown, and Nicole Kidman as Virginia Woolf herself. Now, To the Lighthouse is a 1927 novel and regarded as the finest work of stream of consciousness technique. It is set in the Ramsay summer home. What is Ramsay? That is the name of the family, the Ramsays. It is set in the Ramsay summer home in the Hebrides in Scotland on the Isle of Skye. That is an island in the archipelago. The Hebrides archipelago. Archipelago means group of islands. The novel To the Lighthouse explores the relationship of the members of the Ramsay family. There are 3 sections in the novel: The Window, Time Passes, and To the Lighthouse. The first section, The Window, depicts an afternoon and an evening. Just an afternoon and an evening. The second section, Time Passes, maps an interlude of 10 years. Suddenly 10 years pass, during which the house remains unoccupied. The third section is set in one morning at the end of these 10 years. So that is the time spacing. Mr. and Mrs. Ramsay, their children and guests are on a holiday on an island in the Hebrides a few years before the First World War. Mr. and Mrs. Ramsay, their children and their guests are on one of the islands, the Isle of Skye in the Hebrides. And that is the beginning of the novel. After that, time passes in the second section. House lies empty. Mrs. Ramsay dies. And one of her sons is killed in the war, and a daughter dies in childbirth. The remaining members of the family revisit their house. At the end of the novel, they once again revisit their house in Hebrides. And in the first section, there was a visit to the lighthouse planned, which did not take place. That visit happens now. That visit to the lighthouse happens. Mrs. Ramsay had promised their son James that they would go to the lighthouse, but Mr. Ramsay intervened and stopped it. Lily Briscoe is the painter and guest. She finishes her painting. She was unable to finish her painting before. Now, after many years, she is able to finish her painting because she is finally able to see the proper significance of Mrs. Ramsay the family, and everything else. In this novel, more than any of these characters, there's another character, time. Time appears as a character. There's yet another character, the waves or the sea. The ocean and its waves are a relentless presence in the novel. So let us take a closer look at the novel. Let us go part by part. Part 1 is the window. The window opens just before World War I. As you already know, Mr. Ramsay and Mrs. Ramsay, they are a middle-aged couple. They bring their 8 children to their summer home in the Isle of Skye in the Hebrides. Hebrides is a group of islands in western Scotland. Mr. Ramsay is a troubled philosopher who needs his wife's comfort. He depends on his wife. He is a very troubled philosopher who is afraid of failure. He fears that his work would turn out to be insignificant. Mrs. Ramsay is a charming social artist. She is the connecting link among friends and in the family. She is the charming lady. She is the connecting link. And all the others in the family are disconnected. They cannot understand one another. The husband and wife, Mr. and Mrs. Ramsay, are very different from each other, but very much in love. Mrs. Ramsay assures her 6-year-old son, James, that they would visit the lighthouse the next day. But however, Mr. Ramsay, the father, insists that the weather will not be clear enough to go, and he refuses to give permission. This causes a tension between Mr. and Mrs. Ramsay and between Mr. Ramsay and James. James, as well as the other children, do not like their father, or they are not very close to their father as much as they are to their mother. There is also a suggestion of Oedipal complex here, which has been explored by other modernist writers like D.H. Lawrence. A few friends of the Ramsays who are very different from one another and who are also very isolated are visiting them. It is a very difficult group. And Mrs. Ramsay is the one who's holding them together. Among them is Lily Briscoe, an independent but unattractive woman. She's a painter, as you know. And she begins a post-impressionist painting of Mrs. Ramsay reading to James near the window. Mrs. Ramsay reading to James, that is what she is painting. But it is not a realistic painting. She's painting it in the form of a purple triangle. And she has trouble finishing it. You might think, what is there to draw in a purple triangle? So easy. But she takes years to complete it. Another character is Charles Tansley, a poor snobbish student of Mr. Ramsay, unpleasant in behavior. He thinks women can neither paint nor write. William Banks is a botanist and a widower. He's a kind widower. Mrs. Ramsay thinks that he should marry Lily Briscoe, but she enjoys her independence in a platonic relationship. She does not want to get married, Lily Briscoe. Augustus Carmichael is another guest. He's a poet and he uses opium. His poetry was little known until the First World War, and then he became popular. The section closes with a dinner party. That is the first section, the window. The party is a disaster, as I told you to begin with, because some guests arrive late. Augustus Carmichael, a poet, asks for a second serving of soup, and Mr. Ramsay is rude. Charles Tansley is bullying Lily. The characters reveal themselves to be rough and isolated and lonely. But due to Mrs. Ramsay's social art, the guests come together in a brief understanding and all ends well. The second section is time passes, as you know. 10 years pass, during which the First World War begins and ends. Mrs. Ramsay is dead. Prue, their daughter, has also died from complications of childbirth. Andrew, their son, is killed in the war. So many people have died. And death is metaphoric here. Death is also the death of not only personal relationships, but also of a world order. The Ramsay summer house is dilapidated. The deterioration of the house is a metaphor. The remaining family and guests revisit the house. And then we have the third part that morning in the section called The Lighthouse. Mr. Ramsay finally plans on taking the long-delayed trip to the lighthouse with his son James. He is now 16 years old. And his daughter Camilla. Everything is not smooth. At first there is some delay, but soon they set off. James keeps the sailing boat steady, and he hears praises instead of usual harsh words from his father. This provides a rare moment of connection between father and son, and Cam's attitude towards her father also changes from resentment to eventual admiration. They are accompanied by the fisherman McAllister and his son, who catches fish during the trip. That is important. While they set sail for the lighthouse, Lily is finally able to complete the painting that she has held in her mind since the start of the novel. It has been 10 years that she has been thinking about this painting and trying to complete it. And then she completes the painting. She draws one final line there in the center. This is a reassertion of her independence. Art is perhaps the only hope of surety in a world destined and determined to change. Everything is changing in the world. The only surety is art. Lily reflects that nothing stays, all changes. Everything changes, nothing stays, but not words, not paint. I just put a picture here of a lighthouse to create the mood. The constant lashing of the waves and that lone lighthouse. Mrs. Ramsay was the lighthouse. She held everything together. And time changes everything. Now, Orlando, a biography, came in 1928. It's a combination of novel and biography. Orlando is actually an anti-novel that defies the conventions of the genre of the novel and satirizes the conventions used by historical biographers. It is an anti-novel that satirizes the conventions used by historical biographers. Orlando is based in part on the life of Virginia Woolf's lover, Vita Sackville West, and reveals the author's passion for and identification with the protagonist or the subject. When the novel begins, Orlando is a young nobleman and poet in the late 16th century. That is when the novel begins. And then he becomes the favorite of Queen Elizabeth. Orlando writes Ethelbert, a tragedy in 5 acts, and many more works. Then, as the novel continues, years pass, and the poet Orlando befriends another poet, Nicholas Green. And he has many adventures with women. He gets dukedom. And centuries pass actually, not years. Then, from the Elizabethan period, it is now the Restoration period. And Orlando writes a long poem called The Oak Tree. He travels to Constantinople, where he sleeps for a week and transforms into a woman. He continuously sleeps for a week and transforms into a woman. Lady Orlando he becomes. Lady Orlando becomes a high society woman, moving in the literary circles of Pope, Addison and Swift. And in the Victorian period, he marries a sailor and gives birth to a baby. Not he, she. She marries a sailor and gives birth to a baby. Nicholas Green is an influential critic at this time. The Friend, he has also not died, and he gets The Oak Tree published. In the 1920s, when the novel ends, Orlando is a young poet, as he or she was at the beginning. After all these centuries, he or she is again a young poet, but at this time, a female one. My God, anti-novel. Now, the darker novels of the 1930s. The Waves, 1931, is a completely unconventional symbolic work of great poetic beauty. The Waves. Here, the consciousness of 6 characters is presented in a series of internal monologues. The consciousness of 6 characters through interior monologues, separated by interludes into 9 unnumbered sections, each corresponding to a time of day and stages in a person's life. Each section out of the 9 corresponds with the time of the day and a stage in a person's life, such as childhood, adolescence, etc. The Waves is a fascinating novel described as a prose poem. Flush, a biography, published in 1933. It is a semi-biographical novel again. This time it is the biography of a cocker spaniel or a dog owned by the Victorian poet Elizabeth Barrett Browning. It is the biography, fictional biography of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's dog. It was written for light relief after The Waves, and she wrote it after having read the love letters of the Brownings. And it also provides social commentary. The Years, 1937, is Woolf's longest novel and the last published in her lifetime. Originally conceived as a novel essay. The Years, originally conceived as a novel essay. It shows the history of the upper class Purjeter family from the 1880s to the mid-1930s. The upper class family of the Purjeters. The sections of the novel are titled after years, and passage of time is a central concern, like in To the Lighthouse. The book The Years begins with the characters when they are young and ends with a grand party, again a party, when they are old. The middle part of the book shows a stasis. It was the same thing in To the Lighthouse. One party at the beginning, another party at the end, in the middle, stasis and death. The Years is a novel that attacks Victorianism. The last novel by Virginia Woolf is Between the Acts, 1941, published posthumously. The acts refer to the performance of a play in a small English village just before the outbreak of World War II. A play is being enacted in a small English village. The time is just before the outbreak of World War II. And the acts refers to the 2 world wars as well as the acts of the play. The play is written by one Miss Latrobe, a domineering spinster. The acts also refer to World Wars I and II. So it is the acts in the play as well as the horrendous act of the war. It's a highly imaginative and symbolic narrative encompassing almost all of English history. So that's about Virginia Woolf's novels. Now let us take a quick look at the essays of the 1920s and 30s. I'll be making videos on, I have already made on modern fiction. I'll also be making a video on A Room of One's Own very soon. You should watch that also in Udemy. The essays of the 1920s and 30s concerned with feminism and pacifism. A very important book of essays is The Common Reader, 1925. A Room of One's Own came in 1929. 3 Guineas is its sequel, as I told you, came in 1938. Professions for Women came in 1931. It's an essay in The Common Reader. The Death of Moth and Other Essays. Let us take a look at The Common Reader. First collection of essays it is by Virginia Woolf. In the preface, quoting Dr. Johnson, she praises the common reader, who is spontaneous in his perceptions. The common reader is not like the critic. The common reader is spontaneous in his perceptions, being neither scholar nor critic, and is uncorrupted by literary prejudices. The common reader is uncorrupted. In the essay Modern Fiction, Woolf distinguishes between the materialists, who focused on material reality, like Galsworthy and Bennett. They are different from writers like James Joyce and herself, Virginia Woolf. The materialists like Galsworthy and Bennett focus on the superficial aspects of things and events at the expense of inner meaning. They do not write inner meaning. They spend immense skill and immense industry making the trivial and the transitory appear the true and the enduring. That is what she says. By contrast, Joyce and Woolf are spiritual. They want to convey that innermost flame of people and events, even if this leads them away from realistic writing. Writers like Woolf reveal the extraordinary quality of an ordinary mind on an ordinary day. Writers like Woolf write about the extraordinary quality of ordinary things. An ordinary mind. What happens in the mind is what is important to them. The modern essay was originally written as a review of Ernest Rice's 5-volume anthology titled Modern English Essays 1870 to 1920. How it strikes a contemporary examines the question of why 2 distinguished critics can agree on a masterpiece written 200 years ago and prove its quality by certain rules, and yet cannot agree on a contemporary work. Critics can agree on something that was written 200 years ago, but they cannot agree on something that is contemporary. Now a quick look at A Room of One's Own. It is hailed as the feminist Bible. It is actually an expansion of her lecture on women and fiction. The book presents a balanced approach to women's position in society and the factors that impede the natural outflow of her creativity. The book advances the thesis that a woman must have money and a room of her own if she is to write fiction. The essay is a partly fictionalized narrative of the thinking that led her to adopt this thesis. How did she come about this thought? How did she come to think like this? She is writing about that process of thinking in a partly fictional manner. She dramatizes that mental process in the character of an imaginary narrator. She speaks like an imaginary narrator. It is not actually Virginia Woolf who is speaking here. It's an imaginary narrator. And she is talking about the mental processes of that imaginary narrator. She says, call me Mary Beaton, Mary Seaton, Mary Carmichael, or by any name you please. Mary Carmichael was an actual writer at that time. It is not a matter of any importance. She is just every woman. A room of one's own. The narrator, that is the imaginary narrator, begins her investigation at Oxbridge College. She's preparing for the for the lecture. And she reflects on the different educational experiences available to men and women and on material differences in their lives. She then spends a day in the British Library perusing means looking at, perusing the scholarship on women. What are the books written on women? She is looking up in the library. That is the meaning. And she finds that all these books were written by men in anger. Turning to history, she finds so little data about the everyday lives of women that she decides to reconstruct their existence imaginatively. Turning to history, she finds so little data about the everyday life of women. There is nothing about the everyday lives of women in these books. These books do not present the lives of women. And then this narrator decides to reconstruct their existence imaginatively. She begins to write about women. The figure of Judith Shakespeare is generated. If Shakespeare had a sister. That was once an essay question asked in net. You have to write about this essay and about feminism also there. The figure of Judith Shakespeare is generated as an example of the tragic fate of a highly intelligent woman. If Shakespeare had a sister called Judith, would she have become famous like Shakespeare? Or, even though she was a highly intelligent woman, would she have met with a tragic fate? She considers the achievements of the major women novelists of the 19th century. The women's tradition she is recreating. She is studying the achievements of the major women canonical writers. Then she reflects on the importance of tradition to an aspiring writer. She offers a survey of the current state of literature conducted through a reading of the first novel of one of the narrator's contemporaries. Reading of one of the contemporaries of the narrator, Mary Carmichael. Remember that name we said before? Her first novel, Life's Adventure, she is reading, analyzing. Through that, she is conducting a survey of the current state of literature. Finally, there is an exhortation to women to take up the tradition and to increase the endowment for their own daughters. Three Guineas is a sequel to Room of One's Own. It was first conceived as a novel essay which would tie up the loose ends in a room of one's own. The opening line is 3 years is a long time to leave a letter unanswered. She is referring to a letter from an educated gentleman that she got asking her opinions on war. And then she refers to 2 more letters, all 3 seeking a gift of £1 each. One letter asked £1 for the prevention of war. Another letter asked £1 for a building fund for a women's college. And another letter asked £1 for promoting women's employment. 3 guineas. The essay is a powerful indictment on the practices of Victorian patriarchal system. The Death of Moth and Other Essays, 1942, contains the essay Professions for Women. I earlier said it is there in Common Reader. It was a mistake. An abridged version of the speech. This essay is an abridged version of the speech that Virginia Woolf delivered before a branch of the National Society for Women's Service on January 21, 1931. Here she attacks the Victorian stereotype of the selfless, sacrificial woman or the angel in the house. Coventry Patmore had written a poem called Angel in the House. Borrowing this term for the sacrificial woman, she attacks that stereotype. Killing the angel in the house, said Virginia Woolf, was part of the occupation of a woman writer. A woman writer should kill the angel. The Captain's Deathbed, 1950 book, contains the famous essay Mr. Bennet and Mrs. Brown. It is an early essay actually, written at the beginning of her career as a novelist. She had not yet become a novelist at that time. It's a satirical essay, one of the several by Woolf on the state of modern fiction. And this essay was written in reply to Arnold Bennett's statement that the novel is in crisis at that time due to the failure of the young Georgian novelists in character making. Now, the Edwardian period came before the Georgian period. The Edwardian novelists are H.G. Wells, Arnold Bennett, Galsworthy, etc. And Arnold Bennett is blaming the later Georgian writers like E.M. Forster, D.H. Lawrence, James Joyce, Lytton Strachey, the modernists, Eliot, Virginia Woolf herself. They are the Georgians. The Georgians are not good at character making. Look at James Joyce's novels, for example. The character is not a fully drawn, well-rounded character like it was in traditional novels, like Hardy or earlier canonical writers. So Arnold Bennett, who wrote about materialist reality, is blaming the later writers like James Joyce and others of the Georgian period, the younger writers, of not developing character very well. And Arnold Bennett says character is crucial to the genre of the novel. Well, Virginia Woolf agrees to his views, says, character is the most crucial element. And the current state of the novel is not very hopeful. It is not a very good future that she also sees for the novel. But she argues that the blame should be on the Edwardian writers like Galsworthy, Wells and Bennett himself, rather than on the Georgians. She says it is their focus on external reality that created the problem. James Joyce does not create characters in the traditional sense, but he explores the psychological reality. He draws the character more deeply than any earlier writer. Here Woolf makes the famous statement, on or about December 1910, human nature changed. This statement signals the beginning of modernism. So that brings us to the end of the video on Virginia Woolf. Please watch the video carefully several times. Read a little bit extra, and that should really equip you to face the exams. Thank you.